Village of Stillwater did not measure time like other places. While the world beyond the valley counted seconds, minutes, and hours in frantic ticks, Stillwater kept time in different increments entirely. The unfurling of a fern. The unfurling of a fern. Journey of a shadow across the cobblestones from solstice to equinox. The slow sigh of the old stone bridge as it settled deeper into the riverbank. Over a generation, here, time was not something to be spent or saved, tasted, like the first cold air of autumn, or held, like a smooth stone warmed by afternoon sun. At the village's heart, in a square so quiet you could hear moss growing on the north side of the rooftops, stood the slow clock. It was not impressive to look at, not at first glance. A simple stone plinth, waist high, worn smooth by centuries of weather and something else. The gentle touch of hands, upon it rested a glass case, clearer than any window pane. And within that case lay the clock's face. But there were no numbers, no hour hand, no minute hand chasing its tail. Instead, the face was a disk of polished slate, and upon it moved a single, slender shadow cast by a slender crystal spire at the case's center. This shadow did not mark hours. It measured the turning of seasons, the breathing of the land, the quiet changes that other clocks were too impatient to notice. The shadow took a full year to complete its circle, and tonight, as it had for 3 the shadow 100 years, the slow clock needed tending. Elara knew this in her bones, the way birds know when to turn south. She stood at her window, watching moonlight silver the square below. In her hand, she held this month's offering, a single this month's offering, feather from a barn owl, so soft it seemed made of breath and moonlight. It was the 3rd night of the full moon, the night her grandfather had taught her was proper for winding. Winding wasn't quite the right word. There was no key, no cranking of springs. To wind the slow clock was to feed it memories, to give it pieces of the world it was meant to measure. Elara was 17, and the keeper now, the title had passed to her 6 months ago, when her grandfather's own time had finally, gently run out. He hadn't died in a dramatic sense. One morning he simply hadn't woken up, a faint smile on his face, as if he'd stepped into a dream and found it so pleasant he'd decided to stay. The village elders had found the brass token of the keepership on his nightstand, placed deliberately beside an empty cup of chamomile tea, and that same day, Elara had found it on her own pillow, still warm. She hadn't asked for this. She was a girl of maps and books, off us imagining worlds beyond the valley's rim. She dreamed of cities with clocks that chimed every hour, of trains that ran on schedules, of the frantic, fascinating pulse of a life measured in minutes. Yet, here she was, holding a feather, about to perform a ritual older than the oldest tree in the Stillwood, sighing. She pulled on her thick wool shawl, the one her grandfather had woven, still smelling of cedar and pipe smoke, and slipped from her cottage. The night accepted her. The night accepted her immediately, In Stillwater, the dark was not an absence, but a presence. It was soft, like velvet, and full of small, comfortable sounds. The distant chime of water over stones, the rustle of a hedgehog in the lane, the wind humming a low note as it passed through the eaves of the thatched roofs. Elara's footsteps were silent on the dew-damp cobbles. The square was empty, the moonlight pooling in the basin of the dry fountain. The slow clock stood in the center, its glass dome, catching the moon and holding it like a captive star. As she approached, the usual resentment bubbled up. Why me, she thought, not for the first time. Her brother Liam was far more suited, patient, grounded, his hands clever with wood and soil. He understood the rhythms of the land. Elara's rhythms were internal, restless, a fluttering against the cage of routine. She felt like a clock trying to tick faster in a town that measured time in glacial drifts. She reached the plinth. Up close, the clock was more beautiful. The slate face, under the moon's gaze, revealed subtle patterns, whorls of silver and deep gray like a frozen galaxy. The crystal spire was flawless, drawing in the faint light and bending it gently toward the shadow on the slate. The shadow itself was currently pointing toward a faint etching that resembled a bare tree branch. Deep winter's repose. Elara knew the ritual by heart. She placed her left palm flat on the sun-warmed stone of the plinth, feeling the day's last heat seeping into her skin. With her right hand, she reached for the almost invisible seam in the glass dome. There was no latch, no hinge visible, but as her fingers found the right spot, a place her grandfather's hand had guided hers to 100 times, a section of the glass silently swung inward, just wide enough to admit her hand in the offering. A sigh seemed to escape the case, not of air, but of age. It smelled of cold stone, of pressed flowers forgotten in a book, of ozone after distant rain. For the turning, she whispered, the old words coming automatically, a token of the silent flight. She placed the owl feather on the slate, just beside the crystal's base. Nothing happened for 3 heartbeats. Then, the feather began to dissolve, not burn, not wither, but unmake itself into thousands of alvins of particles of soft, gray light. These lights swirled once, twice, around the crystal spire, and were drawn into it. The crystal glowed faintly, a cool moonlight blue, and the shadow on the slate moved. It was a movement so slow it was what? It was a movement so slow it almost imperceptible, but Elara, trained to see, noticed. The shadow shifted a hair's breadth, no more than the width of a spider's silk, along its circular path. It was now pointing just past the bare branch, toward the next etching, a single, delicate snowdrop. The first promise, a week of the village's time, advanced by the essence of silent flight. Elara felt familiar. Elara felt the familiar. Frustrated, the world was vast, and she was here, feeding the clock feathers and leaves while life happened elsewhere. As she withdrew her hand and the glass sealed itself, a flash of rebellion sparked. What if she didn't use the gentle things? What if she fed it something? else. Something that held a different kind of time. The thought was heresy. The rules were clear, passed down through generations of keepers. Only natural, gentle tokens. A spring bud, a summer honeycomb fragment, an autumn leaf, a winter's first frost, captured on a pine needle. But the skallen wine of the wine hours abound cassayers. Winter's varying hives, Messelwire begieren and Ervian. But with rules hadn't been written for her. For a girl who felt the slow, silent dread of being stuck forever in a single, unchanging moment. She looked around the square, her gaze landing on the old inn. The slumbering fox, he's been landing on the old inn. Slumbering fox in its window. A can still guttered, and beside the candle, discarded on the sill, was a broken piece of a child's toy. A little wooden horse, its leg snapped off. It had been left there days ago, a testament to a moment of frustration or accident. An idea, terrible and thrilling, took root. What was a broken toy, if not a piece of time? It held a memory. A moment of play. A moment of breakage. It was human time. Measured. Emotional. Flawed. Before she could stop herself, Elara crossed the square. She plucked the broken horse from the windowsill. It was small, fitting neatly in her palm, the splintered wood rough against her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rapid, modern beat in the ancient silence. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but she was so tired of slow, she returned to the clock. Her hands trembled as she found the seam again. The glass swung open, the sigh of ages washed over her. For the turning, she whispered, her voice unsteady, a token of broken play. She placed the wooden horse beside the crystal spire. For a moment, nothing. Then, a sound. A tiny, sharp crack from within the crystal. The wood didn't dissolve into gentle light. It blackened, shriveled, and collapsed into a pinch of soot. The soot shot into the crystal, staining it with a dark, smoky vein. The crystal's glow turned sickly, a sallow yellow-green, and the shadow on the slate jerked. It didn't glide. It snapped forward a full inch along the circle. Skipping glassed the snowdrop, past and landing squarely on an image of a sudden, violent rainstorm. An etching that was usually faint, almost overlooked. The unseasonable downpour. A cold wind, sharp and smelling of metal, whipped through the square. Though the air had been still moments before, somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a sound of alarm. Elara stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The glass dome sealed with a definitive click that sounded too loud in the sleeping village above her. The moon vanished behind a bank of clouds that hadn't been there before. The comfortable darkness of Stillwater suddenly felt watchful, charged. She had done it. She had forced time. But as she stood there, clutching her shawl tight against the new, biting chill, a dreadful understanding settled in her stomach, cold and heavy as the river stones. The slow clock did not just measure time. It maintained it. And she had just given it a wound, Elara stood frozen in the square, the taste of copper fear on her tongue. The gentle night had curdled. The wind that had sprung up was no longer the valley's familiar breath. It was a blade, slicing through the lanes with a purpose, snuffing out the warm yellow candle glow from windows as it passed. That single sharp bark from old Finn's sheepdog had been cut off mid-cry, leaving a silence that was deeper than quiet. It was a held breath. The slow clock under its stained glass dome seemed to hum, not a sound for the ears, but a vibration through the soles of her boots, a wrong note felt in the marrow. The smoky vein in the crystal pulsed once, a sickly flash, then settled into a dull, persistent glow. What have I done? The question was a panicked flutter in her chest. But another, colder part of her mind was already assessing. The shadow had moved an inch on the slow clock's face. An inch represented... She calculated frantically. Nearly a month of time. A month of gentle transitions, of frost giving way to tentative thaw, of mun softening. She had shoved it forward in a single lurching moment. The token of broken play had not been a memory of time past. It had been a violence against time itself. A drop of water struck her forehead, then another. Not the soft, misty rain of Stillwater, but a hard, cold pellet. She looked up as the clouds, now bruised purple-black, opened. It was a downpour, but wrong. The rain. The rain came in diagonal sheets, icy and relentless, pounding the cobbles with a sound like rushing static. It was the rain from the etching, the unseasonable downpour. She ran, the shawl, soaked in seconds, dragged heavy on her shoulders. She slipped on the suddenly slick stones, righted herself, and fled for the sanctuary of her cottage. Inside, she slammed the door, leaning against it as her breath came in ragged gasps. Water pooled at her feet. Through the window, she watched the square vanish behind a gray curtain. The clock was just a darker shadow in the tumult. Sleep was impossible. She built up the fire, changed into dry clothes, and sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the flames. Every crash of thunder, a rare sound in the valley, made her flinch. The storm raged for exactly 2 hours, then stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was profound, ringing with absence when dawn came. It was a pale, washed-out thing. Elara, who had not slept, ventured outside. The world was dislocated. The air was cold and clean, but with the sterile cleanness of a scrubbed slate, not the moist, earthy freshness after a proper rain. Puddles lay in the square, reflecting the colorless sky. The villagers emerged, blinking, confused. Mrs. Hemsley, the baker, stood in her doorway, frowning at her herb garden where the sage, a sturdy evergreen, looked battered and wilted. Never seen a storm like it. Old Finn like it. Old Finn muttered, patting his dog, who whimpered and pressed against his leg. Not in Black Frost month. Not ever. Black Frost month. The shadow had been in deep winter's repose. It should have been weeks before the first tentative rains of the first promise. She had skipped a season's gentle gateway. Elara avoided the square, taking the long way to the well. She could feel the clock's presence, a cold spot in the corner of her vision. The rules were clear. After a winding, the keeper was wise to observe for 3 days, to note the quality of the light, the behavior of animals, the dreams of the villagers. It was a time of integration, when the clock's new measure settled into the fabric of Stillwater. But this was no integration. This was a rupture. That afternoon, Liam found her in the small orchard behind their cottages. He was her older brother by 2 years, solid where she was willowy, calm where she was restless. His hands were stained with soil from repairing a wall. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Was it the storm? It was a strange one." "I'm fine," she said too quickly, bending to pick up a fallen apple, rotten and soft. "Just didn't sleep." Liam studied her. He had their grandfather's eyes, the color of the river in deep shade. They saw too much. "The clock. Is it? The clock is fine," she snapped, then softened at his expression. "Sorry, yes, it's fine." He didn't look convinced. "Grandfather said the keepership has a weight. He said some days after winding, he'd feel the whole valley resting on his shoulders." He put a hand on her arm. "You don't have to carry it alone." "Well, I'm here." His kindness was a knife twist. She had broken a sacred trust, and he offered to share the burden. Days of observation were a torture. The dislocations were subtle, but to Elara, who was now hyper-aware, they screamed. Flowers on the west side of houses, which should have been sheltered, were frost-nipped. A nest of robins, confused by violins, confused by the sudden cold snap then thaw, abandoned their eggs. Time itself felt gritty, like a clock with sand in its gears. People were out of sorts. Minor arguments flared at the market. Sleep was fitful, and a general low-grade anxiety hummed beneath the village's usual placidity. On the fourth morning, Elara knew she had to fix it. The token had been wrong. She needed to give the clock something to counteract it, to soothe the jagged tear she'd made, something profoundly gentle, profoundly slow. She thought of the Stillwood, the ancient forest that cradled the valley's northern rim in its deepest heart. Grandfather had once told her, grew loss of deep memory. It grew only on stones that had not seen direct sunlight for 1,000 years, and it grew 1 layer per century. It was the slowest living thing in the valley. If anything could heal a wound in time, it would be that. The journey was a day's walk there and back. She told Liam she was foraging for quiet mushrooms. A flimsy excuse he again saw through but didn't challenge. The path into the Stillwood was a tunnel of green silence. The angry, unseasonal weather had not penetrated here. The wood maintained its own timeless equilibrium. The air was cool and fragrant with damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight fell in shattered coins on the forest floor. She walked for hours, following the memory of her grandfather's stories more than any path. "Listen for the absence of echo," he'd said. "Where the moss grows, sound goes to sleep." Eventually, she found it. A clearing where no birds sang. In the center lay a glacial erratic, a giant stone dropped by a forgotten ice age. It was covered in a cloak of moss so deep and lush it looked like a pelt of emerald velvet. This was it, the moss of deep memory. Using a small bone knife, she carefully shaved a piece no larger than her thumbnail from the stone's underside, where it was oldest. It came away silently, a dense, cool pad as she placed it in a lined wooden box. She felt a profound stillness radiate from it, a hush that made her own heartbeat seem obnoxiously loud. She returned to Stillwater as dusk bled into navy blue. Village felt no better. Lights were lit earlier. as if warding off more than the dark. She went straight to the square, her resolve firm. The clock's dome, in the twilight, still showed that faint, smoky stain in the crystal. The shadow now pointed just past the unseasonable downpour etching. She opened the case, the now familiar sigh of ages greeting her. "For Mending," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A token of deep, deep quiet. She placed the fragment moss on the slate. This time, the reaction was slow, as befitted the offering. The moss did not dissolve into light. It seemed to melt, spreading into a pool of deepest green darkness that seeped into the slate itself. The slate darkened, and for a moment, the smoky vein in the crystal dimmed. The shadow hesitated, then, with infinite slowness, it began to creep backwards. Not all the way, but perhaps a quarter of the distance it had jumped. It settled between the downpour and the snowdrop, on a blank space of slate that represented no named transition, a time of adjustment, of healing. Elara let out a shuddering breath. It was working, but as she watched, the green darkness in the slate began to recede, as if being deemed to recede. Pushed back, the smoky vein in the crystal brightened again, stubborn. The shadow held its new position, but it trembled, vibrating minutely. The moss of deep memory was profound, but it was a balm, not a cure. The violence of the broken toy was a poison in the system. The clock needed a stronger antidote, a counter-memory of equal but opposite power. That night she dreamt of the clock's face, but it was vast, a landscape. She was tiny, walking the circle. She passed the bare branch of deep winter, and it was a real forest of skeletal trees. She reached the downpour, and it was a wall of black water she could not pass, and in the center, where the crystal spire should be, not with anger, but with infinite sadness, he held out his hand. In his palm was not a token, but a small, perfect sphere of clear glass. Inside it, a single maple seed spun slowly, forever falling, never landing. She woke with the image seared behind her eyes. A memory, not a lesson. Her grandfather's greatest treasure, and his final gift to her the summer before he died. The orb of the hovering moment. He'd found it, he said, at the source of the Stillwater River, where time bubbled up from the rock itself. It was a captured instant of perfect balance, the second between a seed's release and its fall, frozen for eternity. It was the essence of potential, of a moment held outside of time's flow. It was the woman held outside of time's flow, object he had told her never, ever to use as a token. "This is for the keeper's heart, Elara," he'd said, "to remind us that time is not a river that crushes us, but a sea we can float upon. It is our anchor, not our tool. It was her last, au compte. It is our anchor, not our tool. It was her last resort." It was under her floorboards, in a box with other childhood treasures. A striped feather, a fossil, a love note from a boy who'd moved away. The next week was a study in grim tension. The village existed in a kind of limbo. Crops in the fields seemed hesitant. The river ran either too high or too low. People spoke of dreams filled with rushing sounds and forgotten faces. Elara moved through it all like a ghost. Carrying the orb's secret weight, she consulted the keeper's secret weight monocle. The thick, leather-bound book her grandfather had left her. She pored over the entries, looking for any precedent. There were notes on gentle anomalies. A year the shadow lagged because of a particularly long winter, corrected by a token of the first hardy bee. But there was nothing about a forced jump. The previous keepers had never been so foolish or so desperate. She found a margin note in her grandfather's neat script. The clock is a heart. It beats with the valley. A hard beat can cause a flutter, but the rhythm seeks to restore itself, if allowed. The remedies must be as organic as the ailment. A poison from the world must be cured by the world. A poison from the world. The broken toy was a human artifact, a thing of crafted intention and sudden emotion. Its cure could not be a purely natural wonder like the moss. It had to be something that bridged both worlds, something human but whole, something that represented time healed, not broken. Then she remembered the violin. Old man Alistair, who lived in the crooked cottage by the mill, had been the valley's luthier. He had made his last violin 10 years ago, a thing of such beauty it was said to sound like the voice of the valley itself. Then his hands had grown too shaky, his eyes too dim. The violin sat in its case, silent. But last autumn, Liam, with his patient, clever hands, had begun visiting Alistair. Slowly, with the old man's guidance, he had been visiting Alistair, restoring it. Not just fixing it, but reawakening it. It was a work of profound patience, of time given as a gift, of a broken thing being made whole, not to erase its past, but to include it in a new future. It was the perfect counter-token, but she couldn't take the violin. It wasn't hers, and taking it would break Liam's heart and Alistair's trust. Another violence. She needed a piece of it, a shaving from its repair. Stealing from her brother felt worse than stealing from Kaelen. Clock. That night, as Liam slept soundly after a long day in the fields, she slipped into his workshop. The smell of wood shavings and varnish filled the air. There, on his bench, lay the violin, its amber wood glowing in the moonlight. Beside it were the tools and a small pile of curled shavings from where he had fitted a new patch to the instrument's belly. Her hand shook as she reached for one. It was a slender curl of spruce, no longer than her finger, as light as a breath. It held the memory of the tree it came from, the skill of Alistair's original cut, the patience of Liam's careful shaping, and the promise of future music. It was time redeemed. She took it and fled. Back at the clock, the village sleeping. Around her she felt a new kind of calm. This was not rebellion, but penance. This was understanding. She opened the case. For healing, she breathed, a token of time made whole again. She placed the wood shaving on the slate. What happened then was not a spectacle of light, but a symphony of subtle changes. The shaving uncurled slowly, becoming a wisp of fragrant smoke. This smoke did not attack the dark vein in the crystal. It wove around it, a golden thread around a black one. The crystal's glow softened, warming from sallow to a honeyed amber. The shadow, which had been trembling, stilled then. With the grace of a falling leaf, it began to move backwards again, sliding smoothly past the blank space, past the edge of the downpour etching, and coming to rest just before the snowdrop. The first promise, once more within reach. A wave of warmth radiated from the clock, spreading through the square. Elara felt it wash over her, not forgiving, but accepting. The tight knot of anxiety in her chest, which had been her constant companion since that first terrible winding, loosened. In the cottages around the square, she imagined people turning in their sleep, their frowns easing. She imagined people turning in their sleep. Had not fixed it completely. The smoky vein was still there, a faint shadow within the crystal, a permanent scar to remind her of her transgression. Years, perhaps. The winters might be a little sharper. The springs a little more hesitant. She had introduced a flaw into perfection, but she had also learned the slow clock was not an enemy, nor was it a cage. It was a covenant, promise between the keeper and the valley to honor time in its own language. Her rebellion had been a child's shout in a library. Her restoration was a first, halting sentence spoken in the proper tone. The following days saw the valley settle. The suns found a kinder warmth. The frost retreated from the herbs. The robins did not return to their nest, but a pair of wrens began investigating it. Life moved on, incorporating the hiccup into its long, slow song. Elara did not confess to Liam. Elara did not confess to Liam, but she started spending time in his workshop, not stealing, but learning. She learned about the grain of wood, about the patience required for glue to set, about the listening required to hear the music inside a piece of spruce. He taught her without asking why, and she learned with a humility she'd never possessed before. Her own restlessness didn't vanish, but it transformed. The world beyond the valley still called, but now it called as a place to visit, not to escape to. She ran my world out to barrel waiting. Realized she could carry Stillwater's time within her. She could be a person who appreciated the frantic beauty of a minute, while still knowing how to hear the story in a season. A month later, on the next winding night, she stood before the clock. In her hand was a token she had made herself, a small, perfect circle of paper on which she had painted, with immense care, a single dandelion seed caught in a beam of morning light. It was not the thing itself, but a memory of the thing, crafted with intention and patience, a human artifact in harmony with nature. She opened the case. For the turning, she whispered, her voice steady and sure, a token of a held breath and the promise of a journey. She placed the paper on the slate. It dissolved into 100 points of soft white light, which danced around the crystal, weaving briefly with the faint, remaining dark thread before being absorbed. The crystal glowed pure and clear. The shadow advanced, its hair's breadth settling perfectly on the snowdrop. The first promise, and as she stood there, the true weight of the keepership settled onto her shoulders for the first time. It was not the crushing burden she'd feared, but the anchoring weight of a deep responsibility, a connection to something vast and slow and beautiful. She was the keeper of the slow clock, She was the one who helped turn the pages of the world for her valley. And in the silent, starlit square, with the gentle shadow marking its imperceptible course, Elara finally felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Time, in all its forms, was now in her hands, and she would treat it with the reverence it deserved. The world began to thaw with a delicate, persistent grace. The snowdrop, etching beneath the shadow, was no longer just a symbol on slate. It became a living truth, unfolding in the lanes and fields of Stillwater. Green spears pierced the frost-rimed earth, changed from a low, grinding grumble over ice to a bright, chattering song over stone. Yet, Elara watched it all with a keeper's newly calibrated eyes. She saw the slight hesitation in the unfurling of the first crocus, the way the willow buds seemed to cling a day too long to their silver sheaths. The scar in the clock's crystal, that faint smoky vein, pulsed softly with the moon's cycles, a persistent, quiet reminder of the flaw in the rhythm. Alley at dawn, a habit her grandfather had noted in the chronicle as walking the rim of the bowl. It was a way to feel the shape of their time, to listen for dissonance one such morning. On the high eastern ridge where the wind tasted of the distant, unseen world, she found the first true anomaly, a patch of ground. A perfect circle no wider than her outstretched arms lay utterly barren, not winter barren, but void. The soil was a pale, ashen gray, soft and loose like powder. No moss, no grass, not a single insect traversed it. At its edge, healthy heather and tough gorse grew in a sharp, unnatural line, as if repelled. In the center of the circle lay a single, smooth river stone, but it was wrong. It was a mirror image of the stones in the Stillwater, same gray, same size. Yet when she looked at it, a profound temporal vertigo washed over her. It seemed to be both there and not there, a hole in reality shaped like a rock. It hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency that made her teeth ache. This was a wound in the world, not just the clock. The poison of the forced time had seeped out. Elara returned to the cottage and consulted the chronicle with a frantic urgency. She found a single, cryptic passage in her grandfather's hand, tucked into a section on temporal echoes and estrangements. A violent adjustment to the measure may, on rare occasion, cause a splinter. A fragment of time may shear off and lodge in the world's flesh like a stubborn shard of glass. These are still points, places where time has pooled and stagnated. They are harmless in their loneliness, but dangerous in their attraction. They seek completion, left untended. They may grow, or worse, draw things to them that belong to other whens. A splinter, she had created a splinter of broken time. The instructions for mending were frustratingly vague. The splinter must be dissolved back into the flow. This requires a token of flow. This requires a token of a profound connection, a thing that binds separate moments into a coherent whole. Often, this is a story, not an object, but a narrative. How did one feed a story to a clock? For days, she wrestled with the problem. She tried sitting at the edge of the still point, speaking aloud. A tale of the valley's founding, a childhood memory of her grandfather. The ashen circle remained, the stone humming its dull, wrong note. The story had to be given, not just told. It had to be a token. The answer came from the last place she expected. Old man Alistair. She had taken to visiting him, partly out of guilt over the wood shaving, partly because his company, like Liam's, was a balm. His mind wandered the past like a familiar garden, and he spoke in meandering, poignant anecdotes. That afternoon, he was reminiscing about the great frost when he was a boy. And for 3 months, the river wore a plate of ice so thick we could roll a barrel across it. He wheezed, his eyes milky but bright. My father, he was keeper then, you know. Elara sat up straight. Your father. I didn't know that. Oh, yes. Before your grandfather's line, we were the wardens of the shadow long ago. He nodded slowly. The frost was a hard time. The clock's shadow stuck fast for weeks. My father said it was because the world was wheeze. My father said it was because the world was holding its breath to get it moving. He had to make a sacrifice. Not an object. A piece of himself. What do you mean? Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. A memory, Alistair said, his gaze turning inward. He had a perfect golden memory of a summer afternoon with my mother before she died. The smell of cut grass, the sound of her laughter, the feel of cut grass, the sound of her laughter, the feel of the sun on his neck. He called it his anchor moment, and he gave it to the clock. He said he walked into the square, opened the glass, and thought the memory at the crystal with every fiber of his being. He said it left him feeling hollow for a year, like he'd given away the color blue from his eyes. But the shadow moved. The frost began to break. A memory, a story of the self, given as a token, that was it. But what memory did she have that was powerful enough to dissolve a splinter of broken time? Her rebellion was too fresh, too laced with shame. Her happy childhood memories felt too simple, lacking the necessary binding power. Then she thought of the orb of the hovering moment, still hidden under her floorboards. The frozen seed, hidden under her floorboards, was not a memory. But it was a captured story, a tale of potential, of a journey eternally pending. Could she give that story? It felt like a betrayal of her grandfather's final warning, but the still point on the ridge was a threat. She had seen a rabbit the day before hop too close to its edge. It had frozen, twitched violently, and then bolted away as if chased by wolves. The splinter was affecting the life around it. That night, under a moon that seemed to avoid looking directly at the valley, Elara climbed the eastern ridge again. She carried the orb in its padded box. In the moonlight, the ashen circle seemed to drink the light. The mirrored stone at its center pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. She didn't approach the clock. This was a wound in the world, not the mechanism. The chronicle spoke of binding separate moments. She knelt at the very edge of the healthy heather, the ashen soil just inches away. She opened the box. The orb glimmered, a captive star. Taking a deep breath, she didn't speak. Instead, she focused every ounce of her will, her imagination, her keeper's sense, on the story within the orb. She thought of the maple tree that had borne the seed, of the autumn wind that had plucked it, of the infinite second of freedom before gravitas claim. A second her grandfather had stolen from time and given to her. She poured the narrative of that suspended animation, that perfect, balanced pause, toward the still point. She imagined it not as an object, but as a stream of silver meaning, flowing from her mind, through the orb, and into the dead circle. For a long time, nothing happened. The wind blew. The orb sat inert in her palm. Despair began to creep in. Then, the mirrored stone in the center shivered. Its surface rippled like water. The hum shifted in pitch, becoming a questioning, almost yearning note. The ashen soil at the very edge of the circle darkened by a fraction, a hint of fertile brown returning. It was working, but it wasn't enough. The orb was a vessel, a teller of the story, but the story itself, it wasn't hers to give. It was her grandfather's. The connection had to be personal. The memory had to be her own binding thread. What was her story? She was the impatient keeper, the girl who broke time, the one who was learning to mend. An idea, terrifying in its vulnerability, formed. She wouldn't give a happy memory. She would give the true story, the story of her mistake, closing her mistake. Eyes, he gripped the orb and let her mind travel back to that fateful night. She didn't just remember it. She relived it. The restless frustration, the cool smoothness of the broken toy horse in her hand, the thrilling, terrible defiance and she opened the glass. The shock of the dark smoke, the jerk of the shadow, the bite of the unseasonal rain. She felt the full weight of her regret. Her fear, the long weeks of gnawing anxiety. But she also held on to what came for the moss. The theft from Liam, the understanding that had grown from the repair. She crafted it all into a single, coherent narrative. A story of rupture and reconciliation, of a flaw acknowledged and a balance, however scarred, sought, and knew. She poured this story, raw and unflinching, into the orb and out toward the still point. This time, the reaction was immediate and profound. The orb grew warm in her hand, then hot, light, not a glow, but a concentrated beam of a fault pearlescent white. Shot from it, striking the mirrored stone. The stone didn't shatter. It unmade, it dissolved into a million motes of light that swirled upwards like a reverse snowfall. The ashen soil drank the light, darkening rapidly, becoming rich and black. The humming ceased, replaced by the ordinary welcome sound of the wind. And then, life rushed in, not slowly, but in a gentle, sudden surge. Moss greened over the spot where the stone had been. Tiny, brave shoot-suits of grass pushed through the now fertile soil. The circle was gone, healed back into the hillside. In her hand, the orb of the hovering moment was gone. In its place was a small, ordinary maple seed, dry and brown. The magic was spent. Fee, Ori had been told. The captured moment had been released to do its work, and was now just a seed again. She pressed it into the newly softened earth at her knees. She had given her story, and it had been accepted. Profound exhaustion, sweet and clean, washed over her. She had not just healed a splinter in the world. She had integrated her own flaw into the tapestry of her keepership. The scar in the crystal would remain, but the wound in the world was closed. Walking back to the village in the pre-dawn gray, Elara felt different, lighter, yet more substantial. The rebellious girl was still there, but she was now woven into the fabric of the keeper. She had learned the most important lesson, the slow clock measure, not just the turning of seasons, but the turning of souls. Its true tokens were not just leaves and feathers, but moments of human experience, love, loss, error, and grace. The following winding night, her token was a tear she had shed upon finding the healed hillside, caught on a gooseberry leaf, and allowed to dry into a tiny crystalline salt flower. The clock accepted it, and the shadow moved with a smooth, silent certainty that felt, for the first time since her transgression, absolutely right. The seasons turned. The scar in the crystal never faded, but Elara stopped seeing it as a mark of her failure. It became her own personal etching on the face of time, a reminder, a teacher. She became a different kind of keeper. She began to experiment, carefully, with tokens that were not just observations, but conversations. A shared smile with a stranger, pressed between 2 pages of a book and left to become a fossil of goodwill. Collective sigh of relief from the village at the end of a hard day, captured in the warm air of the bakery and carried to the square in a closed jar. She learned to read the subtler signs. The way the shadow might tremble slightly before a villager's sudden illness, as if time pooled around a coming moment of pain. The way it could glide with extra smoothness during a week of particular harmony. The clock was not just a meter, it was a barometer of the valley's soul. Years melted of the valley's soul into one another with the gentle persistence of the Stillwater River. Liam married the miller's daughter. Elara's restlessness found its outlet not in escape, but in depth. She mapped the valley not just in space, but in time, noting where the light fell at a certain hour on the equinox, which tree held its leaves the longest, where the first and last snowdrops appeared. She became a living companion to the clock's measure. One deep winter evening, many years later, she found a child Ashira in the square, a little girl with serious eyes shivering as she stared at the clock. "It's broken," the girl said, without looking at Elara. "It doesn't tick." "No," Elara agreed, kneeling beside her. "It doesn't tick, it breathes." The girl looked at her then. "My grandma says you make it move with special things. I do. Would you like to help me next time?" The girl's eyes widened. She nodded fiercely, and so the teaching began, not with rules, but with showing. Elara took the girl, whose name was Anya, on walks. They listened for the quietest sounds, felt for the faintest changes in the air. They collected not just objects, but impressions. The peace of a cat sleeping in a sunbeam, the determined struggle of a bee in early spring. When the next winding night came, Elara let Anya choose the token. The girl presented a single, perfect curl of birch bark, inside which she had placed 3 pebbles. 1 black, 1 white, 1 gray. "For today," Anya said solemnly. It was sunny, then it snowed, then it was just cloudy. all in one day. Elara's heart swelled. The child understood. It was not the thing, but the story in the thing together. They opened the glass together. They placed the birch bark curl on the slate. They watched it dissolve into a swirl of mixed light, gold, silver, and pearl, that was drawn into the crystal, making the ancient faint scar gleam for a moment before being absorbed into the whole. The shadow moved its hair's breadth. Anya looked up at Elara, her face illuminated with awe. "Yes," Elara said, looking from the child's face to the clock, to the sleeping village, to the vast, slow wheel of stars above. "It is." She was no longer just the keeper of the slow clock. She was a weaver, mending the eternal, delicate fabric of moments with tokens of quiet attention and hard-won grace. And in the silent, steadfast turning of the shadow, she had finally found the peace that comes not from the absence of time's passage, but from a deep, abiding harmony with its endless, gentle song. The story was no longer about rebellion or repair, but simply about continuation. One breath, one token, one quiet turn after another. Forever, the years continued their unhurried procession, each one adding a fine line to Elara's face, a new depth to her river-colored eyes. The restless flutter in her chest had long since settled into a steady, powerful rhythm, like the heart of the valley itself. Anya grew from a serious-eyed child into a thoughtful young child, into a thoughtful young woman, her fingers more often stained with ink from the chronicle's pages than with soil. The keepership, Elara saw, had already chosen its next guardian. The slow clock's shadow completed its circle time and again. The faint, smoky scar in its crystal a familiar companion, a teacher etched in glass. Elara had come to think of it not as a flaw, but as a joint in time, a place where the flow had been mended, stronger for having been broken. The valley, too, had accepted its slight hitch. Springs arrived with a thoughtful pause, as if remembering the violent downpour of long ago. Autumns lingered with a melancholic sweetness that poets from the outside world, on their rare visits, would write sonnets about, never knowing its origin. One afternoon in the late honeyed light of a Stillwater autumn, Elara sat with old man Alistair, now so ancient he seemed carved from the same root twist as his chair. His violin, fully restored by Liam's hands, hung on the wall, a silent song. "The shadow," Alistair rasped, his voice like dry leaves, "is nearing the long dusk." Elara nodded. The long dusk was not a season, but a point on the clock's face, a subtle etching of a horizon line beneath a fading, M-colored sky. It represented not a day's end, but a longer, gentler dimming. In the chronicle, it was noted only once every few generations of keepers. It marked a period of profound quiet, a time when the valley's connection to the wider flow of time grew thin and delicate, like a single strand of spider silk glistening with dew. "What must I do?" she asked, though she had read the entries. She valued the living memory in his fading mind. "You must be still," he said, his milky gaze fixed on a sunbeam. "The clock will wind itself. It draws from the collective breath of the valley. Your only task is to witness, to ensure nothing loud occurs." "A quiet month," she murmured. "A quiet soul," he corrected gently. "The long dusk reflects the keeper's state as much as the valley's. If your heart is turbulent, the dusk may umami. If your heart is turbulent, the dusk may thicken." It may become a slumber. The warning was clear. The long dusk was a test of equilibrium. As the shadow glided imperceptibly toward the etched horizon line, Elara prepared. She told Liam and Anya, who told the village elders. A gentle, unspoken agreement settled over Stillwater. Conversations grew softer. The blacksmith's hammer fell with less frequency, its ring more melodic than percussive. Children's games became more secretive, whispered in the lanes. It was not a somberness, but a collective drawing in, like creatures sensing a coming snow. The day the shadow touched the long dusk etching, the change was immediate and profound. Sound didn't vanish, it became textured. The rustle of leaves was impossibly clear, each vein scraping against its neighbor. The distant river was a chorus of individual droplets. The air grew thick and soft, holding light in a way that made everything appear dipped in liquid gold. Time didn't stop. Elara could stop. Elara could feel the shadows glacial creep even now. But it became viscous, syrupy. For the first week, the stillness was a blessing. Elara felt her own mind, usually a workshop of plans and observations, grow quiet. She sat for hours by the clock, not thinking, just being with the hum of the slowed world. She slept deeply and dreamlessly. But in the second week, the quiet began to change. It was no longer peaceful, but expectant. The thick air felt like a held breath. The vibrant, textured sounds became isolated, hanging in the silence like unanswerable questions. A profound loneliness, one she hadn't felt since her grandfather died, began to seep into her bones. This was the danger of the long dusk. In the absence of a long dusk, in the absence of time's forward rush, the soul could turn inward and find only echoes. She fought it. She walked a valley rim, but the landscape seemed frozen in a beautiful, terrible painting. She visited Liam's family, but their movements were deliberate, slow, their smiles gentle but distant, as if they were already half dreaming. The dusk was thickening around her own quiet heart. Then, on the 17th day, she found the second anomaly. She was in the Stillwood, seeking the profound silence of the moss of deep memory to ground herself. But as she neared the ancient glacial stone, she saw it. Above the stone, the air was wrinkled. It was the only word for it. A patch of space about the size of a door hung like disturbed water, refracting the muted forest light in wrong, prismatic ways. Through the wrinkle, she saw not the other side of the clearing, but a different clearing. The trees were younger, slimmer. The light was the bright, sharp green of early summer, not the muted gold of the dusk autumn. A door, not a still point of stagnant time, but a thin place, a window to another when the chronicle had no name for this. Her grandfather's margin notes contained only a terrified scribble. Should the dusk deepen too far, the walls may grow thin. Do not look through. Do not listen. The other wens are not for us, but she was the keeper. She couldn't ignore it. This was her stillness creating this fragility. Cautiously, she approached. The wrinkle made no sound, but she felt a gentle pressure, like a membrane against her skin. She could hear, faintly, the buzz of summer insects from the other side. She saw a flash of movement, a deer perhaps, young and fleet, and then she saw herself. It was a younger Elara, perhaps 15, sitting on the glacial stone with a book, her brow furrowed in that old, familiar frustration. This was a memory given form and substance by the thinned walls of time. Girl sighed, slammed the book shut, and looked up, directly through the wrinkle, at the present-day Elara. Their eyes met. The young Elara didn't scream. She frowned, squinting, as if trying to see through a heat haze. "Hello?" Her voice came, muffled and distant, bright with youthful impatience. "Who's there?" Present Elara's breath caught. This was more than a memory. This was a connection. A live thread to a past self, pulsing with all the raw, restless energy she had worked so hard to temper. And in that moment, she understood the true peril of the long dusk. It wasn't just slumber. It was the temptation to converse with your own ghosts, to get lost in the hall of mirrors that was your own timeline. "No one," Present Elara whispered, but the wrinkle carried it, widened. "You look like... but older. Are you a ghost?" "I am a possibility," Present Elara said, the words feeling dangerous and foolish. "Well, possible me?" young Elara said, swinging her legs with that old defiance. "Is it better out there? Beyond the valley? Did you escape?" The question was a knife to the heart. It carried all the yearning that had led to the broken toy. The scar in the crystal. Present Elara felt a powerful, almost maternal urge to warn her, to shout, "Don't do it! Don't touch the clock! You'll break something beautiful." But she stopped herself. A warning would be another kind of violence. It would be forcing time, manipulating her own past. The integrity of her own story, with its error and its redemption, was sacred. It was what had healed the still point. To corrupt that would be a deeper betrayal than the first. "I found something better than escape," Present Elara said carefully, her voice thick with emotion. "I found depth." Young Elara snorted. A beautifully familiar, frustrating sound. Young Elara snorted. A beautifully familiar, frustrating sound. "It sounds boring." "It is," Present Elara admitted, a sad smile touching her lips. "And wonderful and hard, and it's yours to find, in your own time, in your own way." The wrinkle flickered. The connection was unstable, fed by the unnatural quiet of the dusk. Young Elara's image wavered. "You're not very helpful, you know," she said, but her defiance was tinged with a sudden curiosity. She was really looking at her older self, seeing the peace that lay beneath the sadness in her eyes. "I'm not here to help," Present Elara said softly. "I'm just here to say the story is worth it. All of it." The wrinkle pulsed once, brightly, and then collapsed in on itself with a sound like a sigh. The air smooth. The clearing was once again her own, locked in the deep golden hush of the long dusk. Elara stood trembling, tears carving warm paths through the cool air on her cheeks. She had faced the ghost of her own discontent, and had neither run from it nor tried to destroy it. She had acknowledged it, spoken to it with honesty, and let it go. It was the final, quiet act of mending the old rupture within herself. She walked back to the village, her heart no longer quiet in a lonely way, but quiet in a full way. The deep stillness of the dusk was no longer a threat, but a cradle. That night, she went to the clock, The shadow had moved almost through the long dust etching. It was time to help it complete the turn. The clock needed it to wind itself from the valley's breath, but the keeper could offer a catalyst. She had brought no physical token. Instead, she placed both hands on the sun-warmed stone of the plinth, closed her eyes, and opened her mind. She offered the memory of the conversation in the wood, the pain of the old yearning, the joy of the hard-won peace, the bittersweet love for the girl she had been. She offered it not as a story to dissolve, but as a completed pattern to be absorbed. The clock understood. The crystal glowed, not with light, but with a deep, resonant feeling that washed over the square. A feeling of wholeness, of a circle closing. Inside the glass, the faint smoky scar flared for a final, brilliant moment. Not as a flaw, but as the central thread in a perfected tapestry. Then its light melted into the crystal's core, vanishing from sight, though its presence would always be felt. The shadow completed its passage through the long dusk with a sensation like a deep, collective exhalation. The valley woke up. The viscous air thinned. Sound returned to its normal layer. The golden light shifted to the clear blue-gray of an autumn evening. In the cottages, people stirred, blinking as if from a pleasant nap. Children's laughter rang out sharp and clear and perfectly timed. Elara removed her hands from the stone. She felt empty, but in the way a well-used tool is empty. Ready, clean, and perfectly shaped for its purpose. Anya found her there, as the first stars pricked through the velvet sky. It's over, the young woman said, not as a question. It's turned, Elara corrected gently. She looked at Anya, seeing not her apprentice, but the future. The long dusk is a reminder. Time is not just a line we walk. It's a chamber where all ourselves exist at once. The keeper's job is to listen to the harmony between them, and when the walls grow thin, to have the courage to hear the song, but not try to rewrite the notes. Anya absorbed this, her serious eyes reflecting the starlight. What was your song tonight? Elara looked up at the vast, slow wheel of stars, then down at the clock, its shadow now pointing to a new, faint etching of a rising crescent moon cradling a single star. The new rhythm, a lullaby, she said, for the girl I was, and the I became, and welcome for the keeper. You will bear. She reached into her pocket and took out the brass token of the keepership. It was warm from her body heat. Without ceremony, she placed it in Anya's hand and closed the young woman's fingers over it. The next turning is yours to witness. Elara walked away from the clock, leaving Anya standing in the quiet square, the weight of the future and the past balanced perfectly in her palm. She did not go home. She walked to Thea in her palm. She walked to the eastern ridge, to the place where the still point had been. A healthy maple sapling now grew there, born from the seed she had planted years before. It stood straight and strong in the night. She sat beneath it, her back against its young man trunk, and looked out over the sleeping valley, silvered in moonlight. She was not the keeper anymore. The title had passed as it must, but she was still a part of the measure. She was a memory in the valley's heart, a note in its long song. The restless girl had journeyed not beyond the rim, but to the very center. She had found the depths she'd craved in the silent, steadfast turning of the shadow. And as the true, ordinary, beautiful night settled around her, Elara, now simply a woman under a maple tree, closed her eyes. For the first time in decades, her sleep was not watched over by the responsibility of the clock, but simply by the peace of a story fully lived, and a time well kept. The rhythm continued, as it always would. One quiet breath, one turning shadow, one generation of keepers after another, in the endless, gentle, everlasting now. The world did not end when the brass token left Elara's hand. The sun rose the next morning on a Stillwater that felt, to her, both exactly the same and entirely new. The air she breathed was no longer charged with the singular duty of stewardship. It was simply air, sweet with the decay of autumn leaves. It was a shocking, beautiful freedom that left her feeling weightless and untethered, like a boat gently cut from its mooring, left to drift on a familiar, friendly lake. Anya took to the keepership not with Elara's initial restless resistance, but with a quiet, deep reverence that was her nature. She was a listener, a noticer. Elara observed from a distance as Anya performed her first solo winding. The younger woman did not bring a leaf or a stone, but a small linen bag filled with the dust from the floor of the village schoolhouse. A week's worth of chalk ideas, scuff marks from small shoes, and the faint, lingering echo of recited poems, a token of collective learning. The clock's crystal glowed with a soft, pearlescent light, and the shadow moved with serene certainty. Yes, Elara thought, a swell of pride in her chest. She understands. It is about the story in the dust. But freedom, Elara discovered, was a landscape with its own unknown paths. For so long, her identity had been a stone circle built around the clock. Now the stones were still there, but the center was open to the sky. She spent her days wandering, relearning the valley without the filter of a keeper's purpose. She helped Liam with the harvest, her hands relearning the simple language of ripe fruit and stubborn root. She sat with old man Alistair until the day he didn't wake up, his final breath as soft as the closing of the clock's glass. She grieved him not with the sharp pain of a granddaughter, but with the deep, slow sadness of a fellow traveler who had reached the end of a very long, well-walked road. She began to dream of the world beyond the rim, not with the frantic, escapist yearning of her youth, but with a calm curiosity. The longing was no longer for an elsewhere, but for a and also. She had served the deep, vertical time of Stillwater. Now she felt a pull to experience the horizontal, sprawling time of the world. Its breadth, not its depth, won its depth. Evening, as the first winter stars hardened in the sky, she told Anya and Liam of her decision. "I'm going to walk to the sea," she said simply. Over a cup of mint tea, the fire crackled. A perfectly ordinary sound, Liam, ever pragmatic, frowned. "It's a month's hard journey, Elle, and winter's coming on. You're not a young woman setting out on an adventure." "I'm not setting out on an adventure," she corrected gently. "I'm taking a different kind of walk, a long one. And I am exactly the right age for it." Anya said nothing for a long time. She looked at Elara, and in her eyes was not hurt, but a profound understanding. "You need to feel time flowing differently," she said finally. River reaching the flatlands. Elara nodded, her throat tight. Anya saw her, truly saw her, as no one else ever had. Yes. Will you come back? Liam asked, his voice rough. Elara looked into the fire, her hand. Take a token, she said. For your journey, not for the clock. For you. The night before she left, Elara went to the square one final time. She did not approach the clock as a keeper, but as a pilgrim. Anya was there, waiting. She held out her hand. On her palm lay a small, smooth disc of pale wood, a cross-section of a branch from the maple tree on the ridge. It's from your tree, Anya said. The one from the seed. Look. Elara took it. Revealed by the clean cut was a perfect, dark knot. A tiny, whorled eye. It was the scar of a long-healed branch, a record of an old change made good. It was the still point, translated into tree flesh, a memory of a wound that had become Anya core strength. So you remember, Anya whispered. That depth travels with you. Elara closed her fingers around the wooden disc. It was warm. The valley was a journey out of a dream. The familiar, enfolding hills gave way to rolling farmland. Then the towns where clocks did tick, loudly, in steeples and on mantelpieces. The noise was at first an assault, then a curiosity, and a curiosity, and finally just a different kind of silence. She walked at the pace her body set, which was the pace of the seasons, not of commerce. She slept in barns and under hedges, paid for simple meals with stories of a valley where time was kept by shadows and stories. She met people whose lives were measured in bushels harvested, coins earned, miles traveled. Their time was linear, goal-oriented. She listened to their worries about being late, about running out of time, about time being money. She found she could offer them a strange kind of solace, not with advice, but with a quality of attention that made them feel, for a moment, as if they had all the time in the world. She was a walking still point of a different kind. Months blurred. She followed rivers downstream, the surest path to the sea. The landscape flattened. The sky widened. The air began to taste of salt and vastness. One evening, she crested a final grassy dune, and there it was. The sea. It was. The sea, it was not what she had expected. She had imagined an end, a boundary. But the sea was not an end. It was a beginning, again and again. It was time made visible, eternal, restless, cyclical, each wave a breath, each tide a heartbeat, on a scale so vast it made the slow clock's year-long circle seem like the blink of an eye. She stood there for hours, watching the light die on the water, feeling her own small, deep time meet this immense, shallow, endless time. She built a simple shelter in the dunes. Her life pared down to elemental things, collecting fresh water, foraging for shellfish, watching the weather march in from the horizon. She would sit for days, it seemed, just watching the waves. She held the wooden disc from her tree, feeling its whorled eye under her thumb. The deep time of Stillwater was in her, the quiet, still pool. The vast time of the sea was before her, a roaring, endless field. She felt herself become the strand between them, where deep and wide met and mingled. One morning, after a storm had raked the coast, she walked the tide line. The sea had thrown up its treasures, tangled ropes, shattered shells, smooth glass worn to jewels. And then she saw it, a piece of driftwood, bleached bone white by sun and salt. It was not from any tree she knew. It was gnarly, twisted, full of holes carved by burrowing sea creatures. But its shape was unmistakable. It was a perfect, if rough, model of the Stillwater Valley. One end curled like the eastern ridge, another thrust out like the western woods. In its center, a smooth, bowl-like depression. A laugh, startled and pure, escaped her. The world had given her a token. She carried the Driftwood Valley back to her shelter. That night, under a moon that glimmered on 1,000,000 shifting wavetops, she felt a new kind of understanding settle upon her. She had thought she was on a linear path, from depth to breadth. But she saw a linear path. But she saw, now it was another circle. The clock's measure was the heartbeat of a specific place. The sea's tide was the heartbeat of the world. They were the same rhythm, operating at different scales. Her journey was not an escape from one to the other, but a weaving of them together in her own being. She knew then what she had to do. She would not go back to Stillwater to live. That chapter, that beautiful, deep chapter was complete. Rhythms could meet. For a year, she lived on the coast, slowly, patiently building. With stones from the beach, she built a small, round hut in the lee of the dunes. It had a window that faced the sea and a door that faced the inland hills. In the center of its earth floor, she dug a shallow bowl. She placed the driftwood valley there. Then, from her pocket, she took the wooden disc, the cross-section of her maple tree with its whorled, watching eye. She placed it in the center of the driftwood valley, in the bowl-like depression. It fit perfectly. It was not a clock. It would never measure a shadow's turn, but it was an altar to time itself, to the specific and the eternal, to the deep memory of a place and the endless forgetting of the sea. She would sit between the window and the door, her hand resting on the smooth wood of her token, and feel the two great breaths of the world. The long, slow inhalation of the land, the vast, rhythmic exhalation of the land, the vast, rhythmic exhalation of the land. The ocean, meet in the quiet space of her own spirit. Years passed. Her hair turned the white of sea foam and bleached driftwood. Her face became a map of wind and sun. She was known to the few fishing families along that coast as the Dune Woman, the gentle hermit who could predict the weather by the feel of the air, and who always had a story that made time feel soft. One bright morning, a visitor came, a young man, his traveling clothes dusty, a look of purposeful searching on his face. He had Anya's serious eyes. "Elara?" he asked, standing at her open door. She smiled, not surprised. Time had a way of bringing things around. "You are from Stillwater." "I am," he said. "My name is Corin. Anya is my mother. She told me to find you. She said it was time. A gentle chill, not of fear but of recognition, touched Elara's spine. Time for what, Corin? Corin? She said to give you this. He held out a small oilskin pouch. Elara took it, her old fingers surprisingly steady. Inside was a single dried petal from a snowdrop, perfectly preserved, and a tiny slip of paper in Anya's precise script. Read. The shadow grows long, the new rhythm is ending. A keeper's story is part of the measure. Come home for the final turning. Elara looked from the petal to the young man's anxious face, then out to the eternal sea. The first promise, and a summons. A circle, inviting completion. She did not need to pack. She took her staff, her cloak, and the wooden disc from the center of her driftwood altar. She left the altar itself for the wind and the sand, walking through her own life in reverse. The bustling towns, the quiet farms, the gentle hills rising around her like the sides of a beloved cup. She did not hurry. She and Corin walked in comfortable silence, she savoring the familiar, unfamiliar landscape. He sensing the gravity of her pilgrimage. They arrived at the valley's rim on an evening shrouded in mist. As they descended, the mist cleared, and Elara saw Stillwater spread below, bathed in the liquid gold light of the long dusk. The village was preternaturally quiet. The air thick and sweet. The dusk had come again, but this time it felt different. It felt final. Not an end, but a completion. Anya was waiting in the square, alone. She looked older, wise, the brass token hanging around her neck. Her eyes met Elara's, and a world of understanding passed between them. It's for you, Anya said, her voice hushed by the dusk air. The final token. The clock knows its keepers. The clock knows its keepers. Story is concluding. It wants to include it in the permanent measure. Elara approached the slow clock. The glass was clearer than she remembered. The crystal within blazing, with a soft inner light. The shadow was at the very edge of the slate, poised where the circle met its own beginning. He was waiting, she understood. This was not a winding. This was an integration. Her entire life. The restless girl, the repentant keeper, the wandering woman, the dune hermit, was to be woven into the fabric of the clock's eternal story. She would become part of the valley's time forever. She opened the glass. The sigh that emerged was not of age, but of welcome. In her hand, she held two things. The snowdrop petal from Anya. She held two things in the wooden disc from her tree, the first promise, and the healed wound, the beginning of her duty, and the core of her journey. For the turning, she whispered, her voice strong and clear in the silent square. A token of a life lived in time's grace. She placed them together on the slate. What happened then was not a dissolution, but an expansion. The petal and the wood did not vanish. They bloomed. The petal unfolded into the ghost of a perfect snowdrop, white and fragile. The wooden disc grew roots of light that spread across the slate. From its whorled eye, a tiny radiant shoot emerged, a sprout of pure green time. This vision of life and rootedness rose, not into the crystal, but into the shadow itself. The slender, dark line of the shadow drank in the light, growing vivid, becoming not an absence of light, but a line of concentrated essence. It completed its circle, meeting its origin, and in that moment of completion, the slate face of the clock changed. New, delicate etchings appeared along the circle's path, faint but permanent. They were not of seasons, but of a life, a restless girl's profile. A broken toy horse, a curl of moss, a violin shaving, a wrinkled patch of air, a maple seed, a snowdrop, a driftwood valley, Elara's story, etched into time itself. The crystal gave one final pulse of light, a light that contained the color of Stillwater's dawns, the sound of its river, the smell of its woods, and all the peace of its deep, slow breaths. The light washed over the square, over Anya and Kaelen, over the sleeping village, soaking into the very stones. Then it faded. The clock was still. Gray, the new etchings faded into its surface, visible only to those who knew how to look. The glass dome was clear and empty. The work was done. The measure of Elara's time was complete. Elara felt no weakness, only a profound, effortless lightness. She turned to Anya and smiled. She touched Kaelen's cheek, then she walked away from the clock, not back to her old cottage, but up the eastern ridge, towards the maple tree. Under its now spreading branches, she sat down against the trunk. She looked out over the valley, silvered in the deep dusk light, forever held in the perfect, still moment she had just given it. She held in her heart the deep pool of Stillwater and the vast field of the sea. She was the strand. She was the story in the stone. She closed her eyes, and as the long dusk deepened into a soft, starless, and utterly peaceful night, finally, to sync with the silent, endless, perfect turning of the world, not a stop, but a harmonization. A final, quiet note in a song that would now play forever, etched in time, breathed by the valley, remembered by the sea. The circle was not closed, but perfected, its center everywhere, its circumference nowhere. In the everlasting now, the stillness that settled over Stillwater after the clock's final pulse was not the silence of absence, but the quiet of a held note, perfectly sustained. Anya felt it first, standing in the square with the cool, empty glass of the dome before her. The heavy, expectant air of the long dusk had transmuted. It was now a permanent, gentle clarity, a perpetual golden hour that held no thread of night. Time had not stopped. It had simply found its perfect equilibrium, its completed shape. The valley existed now within the finished story Elara had given it. Anya looked at the smooth slate. To a stranger, it would seem blank. But to her keeper's eyes, the new etchings were faintly visible, not as images, but as feelings imprinted on the air. A flutter of rebellion, a chill of regret, the softness of moss, the resolve of a repair, the ache of a goodbye, piece of a horizon. The slow clock's work was done. Its heart, Elara's story, beat silently within the land itself. She turned to Corin, whose face was pale with awe. "It's over," he breathed. "No," Anya said, her voice soft but firm in the crystalline air. "It's kept." She understood her new role. She was not the winder of the clock, but the guardian of the kept time. Her duty was not to advance a shadow, but to tend the story now embedded in the valley's soul, to ensure the thug rhythm Elara had perfected was remembered, lived, and not disturbed. The villagers emerged slowly. They moved with a new, unconscious grace, their steps in harmony with the unchanging light. They felt no urgency, only a deep, abiding contentment. The concept of later softened. The knoll was infinitely spacious. Children played intricate, endless games that seemed to have no beginning or end. The baker's bread rose with a slow, sure perfection. The river's song was a single, everlasting chord. Anya moved through this perfected world, steward of its peace. She began the work of translating the keepership. She recorded how the flutter of rebellion etchings seemed to resonate when a child showed their first spark of stubborn independence, and how the village learned to guide it, not with suppression, but with patient channeling. She noted how the chill of regret settled over the community when a harsh word was spoken, a tangible coolness that persisted until amends were made. The clock's story had become the valley's moral and emotional weather. But a perfect held note, Anya soon realized, can become a cage if it is not understood. A young painter, inspired by the eternal golden light, found he could only paint the same scene, in the same hue, over and over. A farmer, sensing no push of seasons, nearly let his crops rot. Feeling no what his crops rot. Imperative to harvest. The perfection of kept time risked a kind of beautiful stagnation. The story was complete, but life was not meant to be a museum of itself. Anya walked to the eastern ridge, to the maple tree. Elara's body was not there. She had simply become part of the view, her essence woven into the roots and the light. Anya sat, placing her hand on the trunk, feeling the slow, deep pulse of the story within. "You gave us the song," she whispered to the air. "But we have us the song," she whispered to the air. "But we have forgotten how to sing new verses." A breeze stirred the leaves, carrying not an answer, but a memory, the memory of the wrinkled air in the Stillwood, the window to another when Elara had not rewritten her past, but she had acknowledged it. That was the key. The kept time was not a frozen record. It was a foundation. The etchings were not commands, but tuning forks. They set the pitch, but the music had to be created anew each day. She returned to the village with a new each day understanding. Her role was to be a conductor of the kept time, not its warden. She called a gathering in the square. The clock is silent, she told the faces, serene in the unchanging light. But we are not. Elara's story is our ground, our key. But our lives are the melody we choose to play over it. We must live with this peace, not within it like a prison. She began to institute gentle rituals, a daily breath of new, where everyone would pause and consciously introduce something novel, a new word to a conversation, a different path on a walk, an untried ingredient in a stew. She encouraged the painter to try painting with his eyes closed, to paint the feel of the golden light, not just its sight. She guided to listen to the internal rhythm of the plants themselves, a subtler cue than the sun's march. Slowly, life began to move again, not in a linear march, but in a kind of spiraling dance around the central, kept truth, advancing time. They were exploring the infinite space within a perfected moment. Years flowed in this new mode. Corin grew, inheriting his mother's thoughtful nature, but also a spark of his own. He was less interested in guarding the story than in exploring its edges. He would spend days at the valley's rim, looking out at the world where time still clattered and hurried. One day he came to Anya, now her hair touched with the valley's perpetual gold. Tense with a familiar restlessness that made Anya's heart clench with memory. The story is complete here. But what about out there? He gestured beyond the rim. Their time is broken. I can feel its jagged edges from here. It's all hurry and fear of ending. Anya heard the echo of young Elara in his words. But this was not a plea for escape. It was a diagnosis and a call. What are you suggesting? She asked. That the keepership has a final, unfinished chapter, Corin said, his eyes alight. Elara's story healed our time. But what if that story could be a seed, not to make other places like Stillwater, but to offer a tuning fork to their chaos, to show them that time can have depth, not just speed? He wanted to take the kept time out into the world. The idea was terrifying. It was the opposite of guarding. It was dissemination. Anya looked at the empty clock, at the faint etchings of a journey to the sea. Elara had gone out and brought back an understanding that completed the circle. Perhaps the circle needed to open again, to become a spiral expanding outward. The story is not ours to hoard, Anya said finally, the truth settling into her bones. It is ours to share, but we cannot give them the clock. We can only give them the together. Corin would leave, but he would not go as a missionary of slowness. He would go as William's line had perfected, woodworking, repair, and within each object he made, he would embed a whisper of the kept time. A chair would be crafted to encourage a moment of rest. A bowl's curve would feel like a held breath. A child's toy would feel like a held breath, have a weight and balance that invited contemplative play. They would be objects that asked a question of the hurried hand that touched them. Could there be another way? The night before Corin left, Anya went to the maple tree. She did not take a token from it. Instead, she took a single, perfect leaf. She pressed it into a page of the new chronicle, and beside it, she wrote not an instruction, but an invocation for her son. Carry the question, not the answer. Be the wrinkle in their frantic air, that they might see a different sky. Corin left at dawn, a pack of tools on his back, his face set toward the clamorous world. Anya watched him go, feeling the valley's perfect peace stretch thin around her heart, but not break. It was changing, as all living things must, even perfected ones. Life in Stillwater continued its spiraling dance. Anya grew very old, her body becoming a spiraling dance. Anya grew very old, her body becoming a sigh, translucent and graceful as the golden light. She spent her final days sitting in the square, not facing the empty clock, but facing the lane that led to the rim. She was listening to two songs now. The deep, constant chord of the kept time, and a new, faint, brave melody being played somewhere far away. A melody seated by her son. When her time came, it was not a death, but a final, gentle integration. She simply laid down on a bench in the square one afternoon, and her breath slowed until it became one with the valley's breath. Her body faded, like mist under the sun, leaving only a warmth on the stone and a sense of profound, watchful love. The villagers felt it. They did not mourn with sharp grief, but with a soft, grateful sadness, like the closing of a beloved book. They elected no new guardian. The story was now so deeply woven that it needed no custodian. They all were its keepers. Generations passed, Stillwater became a legend, a rumor whispered among those weary of the world's frenzy. Sometimes, a traveler, drawn by the old tales, would find the hidden valley. They would walk into the perpetual, gentle light, feel the deep peace, and see the empty glass dome on its pavement. I know, the redemption, on the stairs of my memories, the equation is spaced, by and my vast neuron on its greater length. They would feel their own frantic inner clock slow, then quiet. Some stayed, learning the spiraling dance. Others left, carrying a quietness in their eyes that confused their friends, a quietness that sometimes, in rare, still moments, felt like a memory of a story they'd never been told. Far away, in bustling cities and dusty towns, there existed objects, a well-made box, a comfortable chair, a child's spinning top with a curiously steady hum. Those who used them often felt an inexplicable pause, a moment of fullness in the rush. They would call it nostalgia, or a time they'd never known, or simple good craft. But in that pause, if they listened very closely, they might hear the faintest echo of a shadow's turn, a token sigh, and the endless, gentle song of a time that was not kept in clocks, but in the willing, grateful, ever-unfolding heart of the world. The story was over. The telling had just begun. Softened into myth, and the myth eventually faded into the substrate of the world, a forgotten melody humming just below the hearing of busy ages. The valley itself, cradled in its perfected time, became less a place and more of an atmospheric condition, a pocket of eternal, gentle clarity that drifted on the map, sometimes found by accident, often sought in vain. To those who stumbled into it, it was a therapy of silence, a holiday from linearity. They would leave rested, vaguely changed, but the memory would blur like a dream upon waking, the exact paths impossible to retrace. Centuries unspooled, humanity's relationship with time did not slow, it atomized. They fractured it into nanoseconds, traded it as currency, optimized its expenditure, and fled its passage with increasing desperation. They built machines to count it with unbearable precision, and lived in perpetual terror of its lack. The very concept of slow became synonymous with broken. The world was a clockwork hive of frantic ticking. In this world, a woman named Kaelen worked. She was a temporal harmonizer, a fancy title for a corporate fixer who diagnosed and repaired time dissonance in high-stakes environments. She calibrated the lag between a trader's decision and a server's response, smoothed the narrative flow in immersive entertainment pods, and treated executives for future shock burnout. Her life was a graph of efficiency, her own heartbeats something to be triumphed. Her life was a graph of efficiency, her own heartbeat something to be related. She was the best, and she was deeply, unconsciously ill. The illness manifested as a sound, a tinnitus not of the ears, but of the soul, a high, thin, constant whine of urgency that underlay every silence. She heard it in theater and silence. She heard it in things. Pause between metro cars, in the dead air of her sterilized apartment. Even in her own breath. It was the sound of time as a starving rat, endlessly gnawing. Her company's biggest client, the Estrella Collective, was building the Chronos. A theoretical temporal anchor, a machine meant to stabilize global financial markets by creating a master clock so precise it could, in theory, predict and smooth out micro-fluctuations. It was the ultimate attempt to control time. Kaelen brought it in to solve the ghost pulses. Inexplicable, soft surges of lag that would ripple through the system during testing, ruining its perfect sync. She lived in the data stream, hunting the anomaly. It wasn't a flaw in the code or hardware. It was an influence, as if a deep, quiet magnet was occasionally pulling on the frantic needles of their clocks. Her instruments, designed to measure increments of time too small for humans to perceive, began picking up something else in interference patterns. Not chaos, but a pattern of profound, impossible calm. It resolved when she fed it through an old audio converter from a museum piece archive into a faint, repeating sound. It was the sound of a single drop of water falling into a still pool at perfectly irregular, yet deeply correct, intervals. It was the antithesis of the Chronos metronomic tick. It was time as a breath, not a mechanism. The signal had a source, not a location in space, but a set of crumbling, contradictory coordinates buried in forgotten folklore databases. Tales of a golden veil, a slow clock, a breathing village, dismissed as pre-tech pastoral fantasy, but the signal was real. And it was interfering with the most advanced timepiece ever conceived. Her corporate mandate was clear. Find the source, analyze it, and either harness its frequency or dampen it to eliminate the interference. A part of her, the efficient, graph-loving part, agreed. Another part, the part that heard the starving rat whine day and night, leaned into the sound of that water drop with a desperate, thirsting intensity. She used her clearance to commandeer a long-range, atmospheric glider. The coordinates led her to a mountain range so old it had rounded into gentle, sleeping giant. She sat down on a windy plateau. The instruments went haywire, then still. The digital maps dissolved into static. Her personal chronometer, which could count the decay of a single atom, simply went blank. She was untethered. Panic. Her oldest companion rose, a sharp, metallic taste. But as she stood there, breathing air that smelled of cold stone and something like distant rain, the panic met an unexpected resistance. The air itself felt thick kind. It didn't suppress her fear, but held it gently, allowing it to be there without requiring a frantic reaction. The tinnitus whine in her soul faltered, replaced by a ringing silence so deep it was audible. She walked. There was no path, only an invitation in the lay of the land. She descended through whispering pines, into a valley shrouded in a soft golden mist. It was neither day nor night, but a perpetual, beautiful twilight. The mist cleared as she entered a village. It was empty, and it was full. The cottages were there, roofs of living moss, stone walls warm to the touch, gardens bloomed with flowers she didn't recognize, their colors deeper, their scent a quiet memory, but there were no people. Yet, she felt them, not as ghosts, but as presences. A laughter baked into the sunlight on a windowsill, a worry absorbed by the bark of a gnarled apple tree, a moment of contentment humming from the very cobblestones under her feet. Time here wasn't a line they had walked. It was a room they had lived in, and the room remained, saturated with their essence, in the center of the empty square. She found it, a stone plinth, a glass dome, utterly clear, and inside on a slate disc, a single, fresh maple leaf, vibrant green, as if just placed. There was no machinery, no power source, no shadow, just the leaf under glass. This was the source, not a clock, a context. She reached out, and as her fingers neared the glass, a section swung inward silently, just as it had for Elara, for Anya, for generations of hands she would never know. The sigh that escaped was one of infinite welcome. Her corporate mission screamed in impol comprimi, her head. Take a sample. Scan the leaf. Map the atomic structure. But her hand, moving as if of its own volition, went to her own neck. She unclasped the thin platinum chain she always wore. On it was a data chip pendant, a solid-state drive containing the compressed totality of her life's work. Every calibration, every graph, every fix for broken time. It was the essence of her old self, the wine given form. This was the only token she had. Holding her breath, she placed the data chip on the slate, beside the maple leaf. Nothing dissolved. No light swirled instead. The platinum chain seemed to rust in seconds, crumbling into orange dust that blew away in a sigh of wind. The data chip itself, that dense nugget of frantic information, simply unclenched. It didn't break. It relaxed, its molecular structure softening, spreading into a delicate silvery filigree that settled over the green of the leaf like a veil of morning dew. The leaf absorbed the silver, its veins glowing faintly for a moment, and Kaelen felt it, a release, not in the square, but in herself. The high, starving wine in her soul didn't fade. It unraveled. It was drawn out of her, neuron by frantic neuron, and laid gently to rest in the deep, quiet hum of the valley. The tension that had been her baseline since childhood dissolved, leaving a space so vast and calm it made her want to weep. She didn't take the leaf. She closed the glass. She sat on the warm stones of the plinth. And for a time that could have been minutes or lifetimes, she simply existed. She watched a butterfly trace a pattern that had no destination. She listened to the wind compose a different song in each alleyway. She felt the collected peace of centuries seeping into her bones. She was healed, and she was now the only living soul in a kept world. The corporate part of her mind, now a distant, fading echo, presented the problem. The Kronos Project. The ghost pulses. Your duty? But the words had no weight. Kronos was a scream trying to silence a breath. How could she explain that the interference wasn't a flaw, but a correction? That the master clock the world was building was itself the dissonance? She knew she couldn't stay. This place was complete. It was a finished sentence. Her presence was a footnote. But she could not return as she was. When she finally rose, her movements were different, slower, not with lethargy, but with intention. She took one thing from the valley, a smooth gray pebble from the dry fountain bowl. It held no special frequency. It was just a stone. The journey back to the world was a reverse birthing, agonizing in its re-entry. The noise, the speed, the fractured light. It assaulted her newfound stillness. The tinnitus tried to return, but it found no purchase. The silence within her was too deep. She reported to the Estrella Collective, in the sterile, humming command center, before a wall of screens displaying the frantic, digital heartbeat of the Kronos. She gave her debrief. The source of the ghost pulse has been neutralized, she said, her voice sounding strange and calm in the tense room. It was true, in a way. She had neutralized it within herself. What was it? The director asked, eyes sharp. A temporal eddy, she lied smoothly. A self-contained pocket of degenerate time, likely a natural geological anomaly. It's decaying. The interference will cease within 72 hours. She gave them 72 hours. She gave them fake coordinates, a spot in a barren desert. They believed her. The graphs, when monitored, showed the serene, water drop pulse fading, then vanishing. The Kronos achieved perfect, dead sync. They celebrated. Kaelen resigned. She moved to a small, quiet town on the edge of a real forest. She opened a workshop, not for temporal harmonization, for repair. She fixed old clocks, but not to make them tick perfectly. She would listen to each one, its particular hurry or lag, grind or its whisper, and she would adjust it, not to Greenwich Mean Time, but to its own best, most graceful rhythm. A grandfather clock might be slowed to chime only at dawn and true dusk. A wristwatch might be set to lose exactly five. I'd be set to lose exactly 5 minutes a day. creating a small, daily pocket of grace. People brought her their broken, frantic things, and she would fix them, always returning them with a slight, almost imperceptible difference. A music box that played a lullaby so slow it could only be heard if you held it to your ear in a quiet room. A child's wind-up toy that, instead of buzzing in frantic circles, would take 3 slow, deliberate steps, pause to look around, then take 3 more. She never spoke of Stillwater, but sometimes a certain kind of person would come into her shop, someone with a familiar, haunted hurry in their eyes. To them, she would hand the gray pebble. "Hold this," she'd say. "When the world gets too loud, don't do anything with it. Just hold it." They would take it, puzzled, and later, they would report back, weeks or months later, that they had lost the stone or misplaced it, but that sometimes, in a moment's stress, they would remember its stress. They would remember its cool, smooth weight in their palm, and their breath would catch, and for a second, the world would slow down, just enough to take the next step. Kaelen would just smile. The valley was not a place to be found. It was a truth to be found, remembered. The slow clock was not keeping time. It was the memory that time could be gentle. And its final keeper, in a workshop at the edge of a forest, was not winding a mechanism, but planting seeds of pause. One repaired clock, one quiet clock, stone. One breathed moment at a time, in a world that had forgotten how to listen to anything but its own desperate, racing heart. The story was over. The remembering had just begun. The seeds Kaelen planted were not like the tokens of old Brian. They did not dissolve into light or feed a hungry clock. They were subtler, more parasitic to the modern world. A quiet virus of pause. Her repaired clocks and calibrated toys spread through neighborhoods, then cities, as curious artifacts or novelties at first, then comforts, then quiet necessities for a certain frayed demographic. People didn't understand why the music box that played a single note every hour felt more true than their smartwatch's pings, but they felt it in their bones. The gray pebbles were copied, then mass-produced as still stones by a wellness company, stripped of their origin but not their faint, calming echo. Kaelen watched this from her forest workshop, with a mix of wry detachment and deep satisfaction. The essence was being diluted, commodified, but it was also spreading. The stillness was becoming a product, which meant it was becoming a part of the ecosystem. It was a far cry from the sacred covenant of Stillwater, but the world was a far cry from Stillwater. She grew old, her hair the color of the ash from her small forge, her hands steady as they coaxed grace from broken gears. She never took an apprentice. The knowledge she held was not a craft to be taught. Knowledge she held was not a craft to be taught. It was an infection to be caught. She simply lived her quiet repair, a fixed point of calm in the streaming data of the age. The day she felt her own time soften at the edges, like parchment held too close to a flame. She did not call for help. She closed her workshop, swept the floor, and walked into the forest behind her home. She carried nothing, not even a pebble. Deep among the ancient, uncatalogued trees, she found a small, clear spring feeding, a pool so still it seemed a real piece of fallen sky. She sat beside it, listening, not to the forest sounds, but to the silence between them. She listened for the high whine that had once defined her. It was gone, replaced by a hum so deep and low. It was the sound of the and low. It was the sound of the planet turning. She listened for the echoes of Stillwater, the sigh of the glass, the feel of sun-warmed slate. They were there, as memories woven into her cells, and then she heard something new, or perhaps something very, very old. It was something very, very old. It was a tick, not the frantic, metallic chatter of the world's clocks. This was a rich, wooden, profound sound. A sound of immense weight, moving with infinite patience. Tick, a pause long enough for a forest to inhale. Talk, it came from the pool. Not through the air, but through the water. Through the stone beneath her, up through the roots of the trees. It was the heartbeat of a different kind of time. A time not of measurement, but of mass, galactic time. The time it took for mountains to shrug, for continents to dream, for stars to live and die in the reflection of a still pool. The slow clock had measured the breadth of a valley. This was the pulse of the stone upon which valleys were carved. Tick. As valleys were carved, sound resonated through her. Kaelen understood. Stillwater was not the source. It was a harmonic, a single, pure note struck on a much, much larger instrument. The Estrella Collective's chronos had been trying to sync to a frantic, human-made metronome while the ghost pulse, the water drop, was an echo of this deeper, planetary rhythm. Her life's work, her infection of pause, had been an unconscious attempt to retune humanity, ever so slightly back towards this fundamental frequency. Talk. The sound was not in the pool. The pool was an ear. The spring was a vein. The entire forest, the bedrock beneath it, the tectonic plate it rode upon, was part of the mechanism. She was sitting on the casing of the world clock. A peace deeper than any she had known in Stillwater washed over her. It was the peace of irrelevance and absolute belonging. She was a dust mote in the cathedral of geologic time, and the cathedral welcomed its dust. She lay back on the cathedral, welcomed its dust. Soft moss. Her eyes opened to the canopy where stars were beginning to pierce the twilight. With each immense wooden tick-tock, she felt the layers of herself, the harmonizer, the repairer, the keeper of a memory, settle, one upon the other, into a stratified fossil of a life. She was becoming a token, not for a glass dome on a plinth, but for the world itself, her story of noise, and seeking, and finding quiet, would be pressed into the stone, a faint record for whatever might listen in epochs hence. Her last conscious thought was not a word, but a sensation, the feeling of the maple leaf from the empty square, its green forever vibrant under glass, superimposed on the vast, dark gears of the turning earth. The small kept time, and the immense, keeping time were, finally, the same. She stopped breathing. The moss accepted her. The roots reached. The great wooden tick-tock did not falter. It counted a different unit now. Centuries later, the forest was gone. In its place stretched a biome of cultivated nanograss and singing carbon towers. The city was called Sylvanor Prime, a marvel of organic engineering. Time here was a curated experience. Citizens could dial in moods, experience accelerated learning days, or purchase stasis naps. The past was a data pool for aesthetic inspiration. The myth of Stillwater existed as a poetic fragment in a vast archive, a symbol of precinct pastoral nostalgia. A young archivist named Tane sifted through the substrata data streams, compiling a thesis on anachronistic acoustics. His focus was the persistent recurrence of certain sound profiles in pre-sync art. The sound of a single water drop. The sound of a single water drop, the crackle of a slow fire, the sigh of a hinge. He believed they were psychic anchors, lost sense data humans craved. His deep mining algorithms, scraping the very bedrock of the city's data core, hid an anomaly, not a file, but a resonance, a vibration pattern buried in the geological scan data of the region, a pattern that matched no known mineral frequency. It was a faint, repeating pulse of profound acoustic order. It was, his software suggested with low probability, a recording. Not a digital recording, a physical one. A vibration had been impressed upon the crystal structure of the bedrock itself eons ago, and had somehow persisted through urban foundational sonics and nanograss root songs. It was the sonic fossil. Sound. He isolated it, cleaned it, played it. Had a texture, a weight. It was the silence of the pool in the forest. It was the silence Kaelen had heard, and within that fossilized silence, his sensitive gear detected ghost imprints, the rustle of cloth on moss, the last exhalation of a human lung, the settling of a heart. It was the sound of a peaceful death, recorded in stone, but more than that, layered under the human sounds, was the echo of the great mechanism, the immense wooden heartbeat of the world. Instruments could only perceive it as a subsonic pressure, a rhythm so slow it made the concept of a beat meaningless. Tane sat in his pod, the curated spring morning of his chamber, feeling absurdly fake. The data ghost in the stone vibrated in his marrow. He felt, for the first time in his life, a sense of scale that was not spatial, but temporal. He felt the feather-light weight of his own century stacked against the granite slabs of epochs. The anxiety of his thesis deadline, the social sync pressures of Sylvanor Prime, they shriveled into insignificance, not with a crushing dread, but with a dizzying, exhilarating perspective. He had found a source, but it wasn't a source of sound. It was a source of context, a tuning fork for time itself. He didn't write his thesis instead. He used his archival skills to begin a different kind of compilation. He started a silent underground stream in the data cloud. He called it the Bedrock Register. Into it, he fed Register, not the fossilized sound, but its implications. He created experiences. A day-long simulation that was just a view of a single patch of moss changing with light no human schedule could perceive. A soundscape that was the growth rings of a phantom tree. Each year, a single, deep tone. He offered no explanation, no product, just the exposure to a different rhythm. It became a cult, then a movement, then a quiet, persistent cultural schism. The registers weren't Luddites. They used the pinnacle of technology not to escape time, but to feel its other scales. They were the new infection. The virus of pause evolved. One day, Tane received a sealed data courier. It was from the Estrella Foundation, the direct descendant of the collective that had built the Chronos. The message was simple. We have monitored the register. We perceive the pattern. The Chronos project never achieved its goal. It only synchronized us to our own fear. Anchor. We wish to discuss harmonization. Tane stood at the great window of his archive spire, looking out at the beautiful, frantic, curated city. He thought of a stone plinth in a golden valley, a leaf under glass. He thought of a woman listening to a pool until she became part of its story. He thought of a wooden tick-tock so slow it underpinned all of creation. He did not reply to Estrella immediately. He walked away from the window, sat on the floor, and placed his palm flat on the cool, synthesized floor. He closed his eyes, and in the hum of the city, he tried to listen past it, down through the foundations, to the deep, slow pulse in the stone. He was not a keeper. He was not a repairer. He was a listener. And the story was no longer about a clock that was wound, but about a rhythm that had always been there, waiting beneath the noise, beneath the feet, beneath the frantic beating of every human heart, for someone to be quiet enough and brave enough to simply hear it and remember the rhythm never ceased. Not really. The great wooden tick-tock of the world clock was not a sound for ears, but a vibration for bones, for bedrock, for the roots of stars. It was the tempo of stars, accretion disks and continental drift, of a maple seed's slow spiral and a galaxy's lazy spin. All the smaller clocks, the frantic ones of markets and metros, the gentle one of Stillwater's shadow, even the measured breath of a hermit by the sea, were but harmonics, ripples on the surface of this deep, abiding pulse. We end not with a conclusion, but at a point of listening. In a city that scrapes the sky with singing carbon, a listener rests his palm on a synthetic floor, trying to hear the truth beneath. In a forgotten valley where light lingers like a held breath, a single leaf rests under glass, a completed story in the geology of a planet. A fossilized sigh is pressed between layers of stone, a testament to A is stone, a testament to As moment of perfect peace. And in the quiet spaces between all things, between heartbeats, between thoughts, between one cosmic breath and the next, the original patient rhythm continues. The story of the slow clock was never about measuring time. It was about remembering how to feel it. It was about the rebellion of a girl who learned that depth is a form of freedom. It was about the mending of a wound that became a strength. It was about a keeper who realized stewardship means letting the song be sung, not preserving the sheet music. It was about a wanderer who found that the journey and the destination are the same place, seen at different scales. It was about a harmonizer who discovered that the cure for noise is not more precise silence, but a deeper kind of sound. And it is about you, now, in the silence after these words. You carry a rhythm within you, one frantic, perhaps, born of deadlines and notifications. But beneath that, there is another, steady cadence of your breath, the patient tide of your blood, the slow unfolding of your own story. You are not asked to find a hidden valley or listen to stones. You are simply invited, in this quiet moment, to notice the space between one breath and the next, to feel the weight of your own body anchored to a spinning world that is itself adrift in a timeless dance, to remember that for all our counting and chasing, time is not a river that carries us away. It is the sea in which we float. It is the sky that holds us. It is the story we are living, one slow, beautiful, irreversible moment at a time. The final token is not to be given. It is to be received. Listen. Breathe. And as you drift towards your own rest, know that the shadow still turns. The leaf remains green under glass. The great gears of the world move with infinite care. And all is, and has always been, perfectly, wonderfully kept. Good night.